This is a story about the shadows we carry and the light we find when we finally stop running. It's a story about a knock on a door that changed the rhythm of my heart and reminded me that our most important work often begins when we think we've finished our chores. Before I dive into the heart of this memory, I want to welcome you. Pull up a chair, get comfortable, and tell me, where are you watching from today? Whether you're in a bustling city or a quiet town tucked away in the hills, I'd love to know where these words are landing. Drop your location in the comments, and if you find a piece of yourself in this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our community. We have many more journeys to take together. The sun was performing its slow, golden retreat, casting long, amber fingers across my hardwood floors. It was that specific time of day when the dust motes dance in the light, and the world feels like it's holding its breath before the evening settles in. I was in the kitchen, the familiar scent of lavender detergent clinging to the laundry I was folding. The radio was playing something instrumental and low, the kind of music that fills the gaps in a lonely house without demanding you listen. Then, the sound came. It wasn't a loud noise. It wasn't the frantic pounding of an emergency or the sharp, rhythmic rap of a salesman. It was a soft, heavy thud, a knock that sounded like it had traveled a long distance and was just barely strong enough to make it to my door. I froze, a pair of wool socks in my hand. My house is at the end of a quiet lane. Unannounced visitors are as rare as snow in July. I set the socks down and walked to the entryway. My joints gave their usual protest, a series of small creaks that matched the house. I pulled the heavy oak door open, expecting a neighbor or perhaps a misdirected package. Instead, I found him. My grandson, Julian, stood on the porch. He was 23 now, a man by all accounts, and taller than the door frame seemed to allow. But as the porch light flickered on, I didn't see a man. I saw a boy who had been hollowed out. His shoulders, usually broad and confident, were hunched forward as if he were trying to protect his chest from a cold wind. His hair was a mess, and his eyes, the same deep chestnut as his father's, were rimmed with a redness that spoke of sleepless nights and silent battles. He didn't say a word. He just looked at me for a fleeting second before his gaze dropped to the weathered boards of the porch. In that silence, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. This wasn't a stopped by for a visit look. This wasn't a forgot my keys look. This was the look of someone who had reached the edge of their world and found nothing but a drop-off. I didn't ask what was wrong. I didn't demand an explanation. I simply stepped back, opening the door wide, inviting the shadows he carried into my sanctuary. Come in, Julian, I said softly. He shuffled past me, bringing a gust of cool, damp air and a heavy, suffocating silence. He walked into the living room but didn't sit. He just stood there, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a denim jacket that looked like it hadn't been washed in a week. He looked out of place among my floral upholstery and framed photographs, like a jagged stone dropped into a still pond. The house smelled of the coffee I'd brewed an hour ago and the faint, sweet scent of the beeswax I used on the furniture. I hoped the familiarity of it would act as an anchor for him. Are you hungry? I asked. It's the universal question of grandmothers, isn't it? We offer food because we don't know how to offer peace, and sometimes the stomach is the only thing that knows how to accept a gift. He shook his head, his chin barely moving. Not really, he mumbled. His voice was thick, like it was being pushed through gravel. I'll put the kettle on anyway, I replied. Tea is for the soul, not the stomach. I retreated to the kitchen, giving him the one thing I knew he needed, space. I leaned against the counter as the water began to hum in the kettle. I've lived 76 years on this earth. I've seen wars on the news and wars in my own living room. I've buried a husband and raised 3 children who all grew up to have their own scars. I knew that when a person looks the way Julian looked, you don't poke at the wound. You just wait for them to show you where it hurts. When the kettle whistled, I poured the water over the tea leaves. The steam rose in a fragrant cloud, momentarily blurring my vision. When I walked back into the living room, he had finally sat down, perched on the edge of the sofa as if he were ready to bolt at any moment. Julian, I said, setting the mug on the coffee table. He looked up, and for a moment, the mask slipped. His eyes were glassy. Grandma, Do you think someone can just run out of themselves? The weight of the question nearly knocked the wind out of me. I sat in my armchair, the one that's molded to the shape of my back over 20 years. I think people often mistake being empty for being finished, I told him. But even a field needs to lay fallow for a season before it can grow anything again. He didn't respond to that right away. Instead, he asked the question that broke my heart. Can I stay for a while? Just a bit. That word, bit. It was so small, yet it carried the weight of a mountain. It told me he didn't know where he belonged anymore. It told me he felt like a guest in his own life. You can stay as long as there's a roof over this head and blood in these veins, I said, and I meant it. The evening began to deepen. We didn't talk about the specifics of his collapse, not then. He spoke in fragments. He talked about the office where the fluorescent lights felt like they were bleaching his brain. He talked about the city where millions of people lived side by side, but no one actually looked at each other. He talked about the feeling of being a failure because he wasn't happy with the things he was told should make him happy. I listened. I didn't interrupt with "when I was your age" stories. I didn't tell him to toughen up. I just sat there, a witness to his exhaustion. I told him about a year in my own life, back in the 60s, when I had felt so lost I'd spent 3 months barely speaking to anyone, convinced I'd made a wrong turn I could never undo. His eyes widened slightly. You felt that too? Oh, Julian, I laughed softly, though there wasn't much humor in it. Adulthood is mostly just pretending you aren't lost while you look for a map that doesn't exist. We're all just walking each other home. As the clock on the mantel ticked, steady, rhythmic, indifferent to our human dramas, the tension in his frame began to dissolve. It wasn't gone, but it was no longer a coiled spring. He asked me if I regretted the things I didn't do. Regret is a ghost that haunts houses that are already empty, I told him. I prefer reflection. Reflection is a teacher. Regret is just a jailer. The darkness outside was absolute now, save for the porch light. Inside, the world felt small and safe. I realized in that moment that this night wasn't just for him. I had been feeling the creeping shadows of old age, the sense that my purpose was fading into the background. But as I looked at Julian, I realized that being a safe place for someone else is perhaps the highest calling there is. We eventually moved to the kitchen for a late supper. I made grilled cheese and tomato soup, childhood food. There's something about the crunch of buttered toast and the warmth of soup that bypasses the brain and goes straight to the spirit. We didn't talk much while we ate, but the silence had changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence he'd brought in. It was the quiet of two people who had stopped fighting the current. He helped me wash the dishes. His hands, though shaking slightly, were careful with my old china. I didn't think anyone would understand, he whispered as he dried a plate. I thought everyone would just tell me to keep going. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop, I said. I led him to the guest room, the one that used to be his mother's. I'd kept the old quilt on the bed, the one with the mismatched patches of corduroy and silk. He stood in the doorway, looking at the room as if it were a sanctuary he didn't deserve. "Thank you, Grandma," he said. It was just 3 words, but they were the most honest things I'd heard in years. I watched him close the door, and then I stood in the hallway for a long time. I could hear the muffled sounds of him settling in, the creak of the bed, the sigh of the floorboards. I went in my own room, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept returning to that look in his eyes. I thought about the generation he belonged to. They are connected to everything yet attached to nothing. They have the world at their fingertips, but feel like they have no ground beneath their feet. They are expected to be on at all hours, to curate a life of perfection while their souls are starving for something real. Morning arrived with a pale, hesitant light. I woke early, as I always do, the habits of a lifetime stronger than the desire for rest. I moved quietly, making coffee and starting a batch of biscuits. The smell of baking flour and melting butter began to fill the house, a warm invitation to the new day. When Julian emerged, he looked different. His hair was still a bird's nest, and his clothes were wrinkled, but the hollow look had been replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He sat at the table and stared into his coffee mug like it held the secrets of the universe. "I slept for 10 hours, he said, sounding genuinely surprised. "I don't remember the last time I slept without waking up every hour." "That's because you finally stopped holding your breath," Julian, I said, placing a plate of biscuits in front of him. You can't rest when you're bracing for a fall. He took a bite, and for the first time, a small, genuine smile touched his lips. We spent that morning talking, not about the big things, but about the small ones. He told me about a book he'd started and stopped a dozen times. He told me about a dog he saw in the park that made him miss the one he had as a kid. Then he leaned forward. How do you know, Grandma? How do you know when you're on the right path? I leaned back, looking out the window at the old oak tree in the backyard. You don't always know while you're walking it. You only know when you look back and see that the path, however winding, led you to a place where you can breathe. Don't worry about the right path. Just worry about the next step, and make sure it's one that doesn't make you hate yourself. Later that morning, the air was crisp and clear, so I suggested a walk. We stepped out into the neighborhood, the fallen leaves crunching like parchment under our boots. We walked past the houses I'd known for 40 years, the miller's place with the overgrown hedge, the old Smith house that had been painted 3 different colors in a decade. Julian walked beside me, slowing his pace to match mine. It was a strange, beautiful role reversal. I remembered holding his tiny hand as he wobbled down these same sidewalks, teaching him how to avoid the cracks. Now he was the one keeping a watchful eye on me, his hand hovering near my elbow when the pavement got uneven. I'm glad I came here, he said suddenly. We had stopped near a massive maple tree that was shedding its fiery red leaves. I felt like if I stayed in my apartment one more night, I might just disappear. Like I was becoming invisible. I stopped and looked at him. Do you know what the best part of being invisible is? He looked puzzled. What? You get to see the world as it really is, without trying to impress it. But Julian, you aren't invisible to the people who matter. You're just in a tunnel. It feels dark, and it feels lonely, but it's still part of the journey. He squeezed my hand. It was a brief gesture, but it meant more than 1,000 speeches. When we got back to the house, Julian went into the living room and made a phone call. I didn't eavesdrop, but I could hear the tone of his voice through the walls. It wasn't the voice of the broken boy who had arrived on my porch. It was steady. He was setting boundaries. He was telling someone no. He was taking back a piece of himself. That afternoon, he started packing his small bag. Not because I wanted him to go, but because he was ready to face his life again. The bit of time he needed had been enough to remind him that he was solid. As evening approached once more, we sat on the back porch, watching the sky turn a bruised purple. Grandma, he said, staring at the horizon. Do you ever feel invisible now? Since you're older. I smiled. It was an honest question, the kind only someone who trusts you would ask. Sometimes, I admitted. The world tends to look past people with gray hair and wrinkled skin. They think our stories are over. But then someone like you knocks on my door, and I realize that my most important chapters are still being written. Being needed, being a harbor for someone in a storm, that's a kind of visibility that fame or money can't buy. He stood up and pulled me into a hug. It was a long, tight embrace, the kind that says I'm okay now and thank you for being the reason. When his car pulled out of the driveway a few minutes later, I stood on the porch until his taillights disappeared around the bend. The house felt quiet again, but it wasn't a lonely quiet. It was a settled quiet. I went inside and cleared the 2 mugs from the table. I folded the quilt in the guest room and smoothed the pillow. As I sat down in my armchair, the radio still murmuring in the background, I felt a profound sense of peace. We often think that to change a life, we need to have all the answers. We think we need to give grand advice or solve every problem. But Julian didn't need a fixer. He needed a witness. He needed someone to tell him that it was okay to be lost, and that the world wouldn't end just because he took a moment to sit down. I didn't change his life that night. He was the one who had to do the hard work of going back and facing his reality. But we met each other in the truth. We shared a moment of absolute honesty in a world that often demands lies. And that, I've learned, is the greatest gift we can give each other. As the night fully arrived, I looked at the spot on the rug where he had stood just 24 hours ago, looking like a ghost of himself. Now, that space was just part of my home again. But the memory of his transformation would stay with me forever. It reminded me that connection has no expiration date. It reminded me that no matter how old we get, We are never done showing up for one another. So, as I finish this story, I want to ask you, is there someone in your life who might need a safe place right now? Maybe they haven't knocked on your door yet, but maybe they're waiting for an invitation. And to those of you who are feeling invisible or lost tonight, remember this: the tunnel is not the destination. It's just a part of the road. Thank you for spending this time with me. It's been a pleasure sharing this memory with you. Don't forget to share your own stories in the comments. I read every single one. Like this video if it touched your heart, and subscribe so we can keep finding our way home together. Until next time, keep the light on. You never know who might need it.